existence, known as Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, and at last Anandamaya. In the beginning of life, every living entity is food conscious. A child or an animal is satisfied only by getting nice food. This stage of consciousness, in which the goal is to eat sumptuously, is called Annamaya. Anna means food. After this, one lives in the consciousness of being alive. If one can continue his life without being attacked or destroyed, one thinks himself happy. This stage is called Pranamaya, or consciousness of one's existence. After this stage, when one is situated on the mental platform, his consciousness is called Manomaya. The materialistic civilization is primarily situated in these three stages: Annamaya, Pranamaya, and Manomaya. The first concern of civilized persons is economic development. The next concern is defense against being annihilated, and the next consciousness is mental speculation, the philosophical approach to the values of life.
If by the evolutionary process of philosophical life one happens to reach the platform of intellectual life and understands that he is not this material body but a spiritual soul, he is situated in the Vijnanamaya stage. Then, by evolution in spiritual life, he comes to the understanding of the Supreme Lord or the Supreme Soul. When one develops his relationship with him and executes devotional service, that stage of life is called Krishna consciousness, the Anandamaya stage. Anandamaya is the blissful life of knowledge and eternity. As it is said in the Vedanta Sutra, Anandamayo Bhyasat, the Supreme Brahman and the subordinate Brahman, or the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and the living entities are both joyful by nature. As long as the living entities are situated in the lower four stages of life, Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, and Vijnanamaya, they are considered to be in the material condition of life. But as soon as one reaches the stage of Anandamaya, he is a liberated soul. The Anandamaya stage is explained in the Bhagavad Gita as Brahma Bhuta stage. There it is said that in the Brahma Bhuta stage of life, there is no anxiety and no hankering. This stage begins when one is equally disposed toward all living entities, and it then expands to the stage of Krishna consciousness, in which one always hankers to render services unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This hankering for advancement in a devotional service is not the same as hankering for sense gratification in material existence. In other words, hankering remains in spiritual life, but it becomes purified. Similarly, when our senses are purified, they are freed from all material stages, namely Annamaya, Pranmaya, Manomaya, and Vijnanamaya, and they become situated in the highest stage, Anandmaya, or blissful life in Krishna consciousness. The Mayavadi philosophers consider Anandmaya to be the stage of being merged in the Supreme. To them, Anandmaya means that the super soul and the individual soul become one. But the real fact is that oneness does not mean merging into the Supreme and losing one's own individual existence. Merging into the Supreme spiritual existence is the living entity's realization of qualitative oneness with the Supreme Lord in his aspects of eternity and knowledge. But the actual Anandamaya blissful stage is attained when one is engaged in devotional service. That is confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita. Mad bhaktim labhate param. Here Lord Krishna states that the Brahma Bhuta Anand Maya stage is complete only when there is an exchange of love between the Supreme and the subordinate living entities. Unless one comes to the Anand Maya stage, his breathing is like the breathing of a bellows in a blacksmith's shop. His duration of life is like that of a tree, and he is no better than the lower animals like the camels, hogs, and dogs.
Undoubtedly, the eternal living entity cannot be annihilated at any point, but the lower species of life exist in a miserable condition, whereas one who is engaged in the devotional service of the Supreme Lord is situated in the pleasurable or Anand Maya status of life. The different stages described above are all in relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Although in all circumstances there exist both the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the living entities, the difference is that the Supreme Personality of Godhead always exists in the Anandamaya stage, whereas the subordinate living entities, because of their minute position as fragmental portions of the Supreme Lord, are prone to fall to the other stages of life. Although in all the stages both the Supreme Lord and the living entities exist, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is always transcendental to our concept of life, whether we are in bondage or in liberation. The whole cosmic manifestation becomes possible by the grace of the Supreme Lord. It exists by the grace of the Supreme Lord, and when annihilated, it merges into the existence of the Supreme Lord. As such, the Supreme Lord is the supreme existence, the cause of all causes. Therefore, the conclusion is that without development of Krishna consciousness, one's life is simply a waste of time.
For those who are very materialistic and cannot understand the situation of the spiritual world, the abode of Krishna, great sages have recommended the yogic process whereby one gradually rises from meditation on the abdomen, which is called Muladhara or Manipuraka. Meditation. Muladhara and Manipuraka are technical terms which refer to the intestine within the abdomen. Grossly materialistic persons think that economic development is of foremost importance because they are under the impression that a living entity exists only by eating. Such grossly materialistic persons forget that although we may eat as much as we like, if the food is not digested, it produces the troubles of indigestion and acidity. Therefore, eating is not in itself the cause of the vital energy of life. For digestion of eatables, we have to take shelter of another superior energy, which is mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita as Vaishvanara. Lord Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita that he helps the digestion in the form of Vaishvanara. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is all pervasive. Therefore, his presence in the stomach as Vaishvanara is not extraordinary.
Krishna is actually present everywhere. The Vaishnav, therefore, marks his body with temples of Vishnu. He first marks a tilak temple on the abdomen, then on the chest, then between the collarbones, then on the forehead, and gradually he marks the top of the head, the Brahma Randhra. The 13 temples of Tilak marked on the body of a Vaishnav are known as follows. On the forehead is the temple of Lord Keshava. On the belly is the temple of Lord Narayana. On the chest is the temple of Lord Madhava. And on the throat, between the two collarbones, is the temple of Lord Vishnu. On the right arm, the temple of Lord Madhusudana. And on the right side of the collarbone, the temple of Lord Trivikrama. Similarly, on the left side of the waist is the temple of Lord Vamanadeva. On the left arm, the temple of Sridhara. On the left side of the collarbone, the temple of Rishikesha. On the upper back, the temple called Padmanabha. And on the lower back, the temple called Damodara. On the top of the head is the temple called Vasudeva. This is the process of meditation on the Lord's situation in the different parts of the body. But for those who are not Vaishnavas, great sages recommend meditation on the bodily concept of life, meditation on the intestines, on the heart, on the throat, on the eyebrows, on the forehead, and then on the top of the head. Some of the sages in the disciplic succession from the great saint Aruna meditate on the heart because the supersoul stays within the heart along with the living entity. This is confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, 15th chapter, wherein the Lord states, I am situated in everyone's heart.
As part of the devotional service, Vaishnavas protect the body for the service of the Lord. But those who are gross materialists accept the body as the self. They worship the body by the yogic process of meditation on the different bodily parts, such as Manipuraka, Dahara, and Hridaya, gradually rising to the Brahmarandhara on the top of the head. The first class yogi who has attained perfection in the practice of the yoga system ultimately passes through the Brahmarandhara to any one of the planets in either the material or spiritual worlds. How a yogi can transfer himself to another planet is vividly described in the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam.
In this regard, Shukadeva Goswami has recommended that the beginners worship the Virat Purusha, the gigantic universal form of the Lord. One who cannot believe that the Lord can be worshipped with equal success in the deity or archa form, or who cannot concentrate on this form, is advised to worship the universal form of the Lord. The lower part of the universe is considered the feet and legs of the Lord's universal form. The middle part of the universe is considered the navel or abdomen of the Lord. The upper planetary systems, such as Janaloka and Maharaloka, are the heart of the Lord, and the topmost planetary system, Brahmaloka, is considered the top of the Lord's head. There are different processes recommended by great sages according to the position of the worshipper, but the ultimate aim of all meditational yogic processes is to go back home, back to Godhead. As stated in the Bhagavad Gita, anyone who reaches the highest planet, the abode of Krishna, or even the Vaikuntha planets, never has to come down again to this material world, to this material misery. I'm sorry, Prabhupada. Down again to this miserable material condition of life.
The Vedic recommendation, therefore, is that one make the lotus feet of Vishnu the target of all one's efforts. Tat Vishnu Paramam Padam. The Vishnu planet or Vishnu Loka are situated above all the material planets. These Vaikuntha planets are known as the Sanatan Dharma and they are eternal. They are never annihilated, not even by the annihilation of this material world. The conclusion is that if a human being does not fulfill the mission of his life by worshipping the Supreme Lord and doesn't go back home, back to Godhead, it is to be understood that he is breathing just like the blacksmith's bellows, living just like a tree, eating just like a camel, and having sex just like the dogs and hogs. Thus, he has been frustrated in fulfilling the specific purpose of human life. The next prayer of the personified Vedas to the Lord concerns his entering into different spaces of life. It is stated in the Bhagavad Gita 14th chapter that in every species and forms of life, the spiritual part and parcel of the Supreme Lord is present. The Lord Himself claims in the Gita that He is a seed giving Father of all forms and species, who therefore must all be considered sons of God, Lord. The entrance of the Supreme Lord into everyone's heart as Paramatma sometimes bewilders the impersonalist into equating the living entities with the Supreme Lord. They think both the Supreme Lord and the individual souls enter into the various bodies. So where is the direct distinction? Why should individual souls worship the Paramatma or Super Soul? According to them, the Super Soul and individual souls are on the same level. They are one, without any difference between them. There is a difference, however, between the super soul and the individual soul, and this is explained in the Bhagavad Gita, 15th chapter, wherein the Lord says that although he is situated with the living entity in the same body, he is superior. He is dictating or giving intelligence to the individual souls from within. It is clearly stated in the Gita that the Lord gives intelligence to the individual souls and that both memory and forgetfulness are due to the influence of the super soul. No one can act independently of the sanction of the super soul. The individual soul acts according to his past karma reminded by the Lord. The nature of the individual soul is forgetfulness, but the presence of the Lord within the heart reminds him of what he wanted to do in his past life. The intelligence of the individual soul is exhibited like fire in wood. Always fire, although fire is always fire, it is exhibited in a size proportionate to the size of the wood. Similarly, although the individual soul is qualitatively one with the Supreme Lord, he exhibits himself according to the limitations
of his present body.
according to the limitation of his present body. But the Supreme Lord or the Super Soul is unlimited. He is said to be Eka Eka means one and Rasa means mellows. The transcendental position of the Supreme Lord is that of eternity, bliss, and full knowledge. His position of Ekarasa does not change in the slightest when he becomes a witness and advisor to the individual soul in each individual body.
But the individual soul, from Lord Brahma down to the ant, exhibits his spiritual potency according to his present body. The demigods are in the same category with the individual souls in the bodies of human beings or in the bodies of lower animals. Intelligent persons, therefore, do not worship different demigods who are simply infinitesimal representatives of Krishna. Infinitesimal. Infinitesimal. Infinitesimal representatives of Krishna manifest in conditioned bodies. The individual soul can exhibit his power only in proportion to the shape and constitution of the body. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, however, can exhibit his full potencies in any shape or form without any change. The Mayavadi philosophers' thesis that God and the individual soul are one and the same cannot be accepted because the individual soul has to develop his power according to the development of different types of bodies. The individual soul in the body of a baby cannot show the full power of a grown man, but the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, even when lying on the lap of his mother as a baby, could exhibit his full power by killing Putana and other demons who attacked him. Thus, the spiritual potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is said to be ekarasa or without change. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, therefore, is the only worshipable object, and this is perfectly known to persons who are uncontaminated by the modes of material nature. In other words, only the liberated souls can worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Less intelligent Mayavadis take to the worship of the demigods, thinking that the demigods and the Supreme Personality of Godhead are on the same level.
The personified Vedas continued to offer their obeisances. Dear Lord, they prayed, after many, many births, those who have actually become wise to take to the worship of your lotus feet in complete knowledge. This is confirmed in the Bhagavad Gita, wherein the Lord says that after many, many births, a great soul or Mahatma surrenders unto the Lord, knowing well that Vasudev, Krishna, is the cause of all causes. The Vedas continued, as already explained, since the mind, intelligence, and senses have been given to us by God, when these instruments are actually purified, there is no alternative but to engage them all in the devotional service of the Lord. A living entity's entrapment in different species of life is due to the misapplication of his mind, intelligence, and senses in material activities. Various kinds of bodies are awarded as the result of a living entity's actions, and they are created by the material nature according to the living entity's desire. Because a living entity desires and deserves a particular kind of body, it is given to him by the material nature under the order of the Supreme Law.
In Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd canto, it is explained that under the control of superior authority, a living entity is put within the semen of a male and injected into the womb of a particular female in order to develop a particular type of body. A living entity utilizes his senses, intelligence, mind, and so on in a specific way of his own choosing, and thus develops a particular type of body within which he becomes encaged. In this way, the living entity becomes situated in different species of life, either in a demigod, human, or animal body, according to different situations and circumstances.
It is explained in the Vedic literature that the living entities entrapped in different species of life are part and parcels of the Supreme Lord. The Mayavadi philosophers mistake the living entity for the Paramatma, who is actually sitting within the living entity as a friend. Because the Paramatma, the localized aspect of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and the individual living entity are both within the body, a misunderstanding sometimes takes place that there is no difference between the two. But there is a definite difference between the individual soul and the super soul. And it is explained in the Varaha Purana as follows. The Supreme Lord has two kinds of parts and parcels. The living entity is called the Vibhinansa, and the Paramatma, or the plenary expansion of the Supreme Lord, is called the Svansa. The Svansa, the plenary expansion of the Supreme Personality of is as powerful as the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself. There is not even the slightest difference between between the potency of the Supreme Person and that of His plenary expansion as Paramatma. But the Vibhinansa, that is part and parcels, possess only a minute portion of the potencies of the Lord. The Narad Pancharatra states that the living entities who are the marginal potency of the Supreme Lord are undoubtedly of the same quality of spiritual existence as the Lord Himself, but they are prone to be tinged with the material qualities, because the minute living entity is prone to be subjected to the influence of the material qualities. He is called Jiva, and sometimes the Supreme Personality of Godhead is also known as Shiva, the all auspicious one. So, the difference between the Shiva and Jiva is that the all auspicious personality of Godhead is never affected by the material qualities, whereas the minute portions of the Supreme Personality of Godhead are prone to be affected by the qualities of material nature.
The supersoul within the body of a particular living entity, being a plenary portion of the Lord, is worshipable by the individual living entity. Great sages have therefore concluded that the process of meditation is designed so that the individual living entity may concentrate his attention on the lotus feet of the supersoul form, Vishnu. That is real samadhi. The living entity cannot be liberated from material entanglement by his own effort. He must therefore take to the devotional service of the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord or the Supersoul within himself. Sridhara Swami, the great commentator on Srimad Bhagavatam, has composed a nice verse in this regard, the meaning of which is as follows. My dear Lord, I am eternally a part of you, but I have been entrapped by the material potencies, which are also an emanation from you. As the cause of all causes, you have entered my body as the supersoul, and I have the prerogative of enjoying the supreme blissful life of knowledge along with you. Therefore, my dear Lord, please order me to render you loving service so that I can be brought to my original position of transcendental bliss.
Great personalities understand that a living entity entangled in this material world cannot be freed by his own efforts. With firm faith and devotion, such great personalities engage themselves in rendering transcendental loving service to the Lord. That is the verdict of the personified Vedas. The personified Vedas continued, Dear Lord, it is very difficult to achieve perfect knowledge of the absolute truth. Your Lordship is so kind to the fallen souls that you appear in different incarnations and execute different activities. You appear even as a historical personality of this material world, and your pastimes are very nicely described in the Vedic literature. Such pastimes are as attractive as the ocean of transcendental bliss. People in general have a natural inclination to read narrations in which ordinary jivas are glorified. But when they become attracted by the Vedic scriptures, which delineate, delineate your eternal pastimes, they actually dip into the ocean of transcendental bliss. As a fatigued man feels refreshed by dipping into a reservoir of water, so the conditioned soul, who is very much disgusted with material activities, becomes refreshed and forgets all the fatigue of material activities simply by dipping into the transcendental ocean of your pastimes. And eventually, he merges into the ocean of transcendental bliss. The most intelligent devotees, therefore, do not take to any means of self realization except devotional service and constant engagement in the 9 different processes of devotional life, especially hearing and chanting. When hearing and chanting about your transcendental pastimes, your devotees do not care even for the transcendental bliss derived from liberation or from merging into the existence of the Supreme. Such devotees are not interested even in so called liberation, and they certainly have no interest in material activities for elevation to the heavenly planets for sense gratification. Pure devotees seek only the association of Paramhamsas or great liberated devotees so that they can continuously hear and chant about your glories. For this purpose, the pure devotees are prepared to sacrifice all comforts of life, even giving up the material comforts of family life and so called society, friendship, and love. Those who have tasted the nectar of devotion by relishing the transcendental vibration of your glories, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, do not care for any other spiritual bliss or for material comforts, which appear to the pure devotees as less important than the straw in the street.
The personified Vedas continued, Dear Lord, when a person is able to purify his mind, senses, and intelligence by engaging himself in devotional service in full Krishna consciousness, his mind becomes his friend. Otherwise, his mind is always his enemy. When the mind is engaged in the devotional service of the Lord, it becomes the intimate friend of the living entity, because the mind can then think of the Supreme Lord always. Your Lordship is eternally dear to the living entity, so when the mind is engaged in thought of you, one immediately feels the great satisfaction for which he has been hankering life after life. When one's mind is thus fixed on the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one does not take to any kind of inferior worship or inferior process of self-realization. By attempting to worship a demigod or by taking to any other process of self-realization, the living entity becomes a victim of the cycle of birth and death, and no one can estimate how much the living entity is degraded by entering abominable species of life, such as cats and dogs.
Sri Narottama Das Thakur has sung that persons who do not take to the devotional service of the Lord but are attracted to the process of philosophical speculation and fruitive activities drink the poisonous results of such actions. Such persons eat all kinds of obnoxious things such as meat and take pleasure in alcohol and other intoxicants, and after death they are forced to take birth in lower species of life. Materialistic persons generally worship the transient material body and forget the welfare of the spirit soul within the body. Some take shelter of the materialistic science to improve bodily comforts, and some take to the worship of the demigods to be promoted to the heavenly planets. Their goal in life is to make the material body comfortable, but they forget the interest of the spirit soul. Such persons are described in the Vedic literature as suicidal because attachment to the material body and its comfort forces the living entity to wander through the process of birth and death perpetually and suffer the material pangs as a matter of course. The human form of life is a chance for one to understand his position. Therefore, the most intelligent person takes to the devotional service just to engage his mind, senses, and the body in the service of the Lord without deviation. The
The personified Vedas continued, Dear Lord, there are many mystic yogis who are very learned and deliberate in achieving the highest perfection of life. They engage themselves in the yogic process of controlling the life air within the body, concentrating the mind upon the form of Vishnu and controlling the senses very rigidly. They practice the yoga system. But even after much laborious austerity, penance, and regulation, all they achieve is the same designation as persons inimical toward you. In other words, both the yogis and the great wise philosophical speculators ultimately attain the impersonal Brahman effulgence, which is automatically attained by the demons who are regular enemies of the Lord. Demons like Kamsa, Shishupala, and Dantavakra attain the Brahman effulgence because they constantly meditate upon the Supreme Personality of Godhead out of enmity. The real point is to concentrate the mind on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Women, such as the gopis, were attached to Krishna, being captivated by his beauty, and their mental concentration on Krishna was provoked by lust. They wanted to be embraced by the arms of Krishna, which resemble the beautiful round shape of a snake. Similarly, we, the Vedic hymns, simply concentrate our minds on the lotus feet of your Lordship. Women, like the gopis, concentrate upon you under the dictation of lust, and we concentrate upon your lotus feet to go back home, back to Godhead. Your enemies also concentrate upon you, thinking always of how to kill you, and yogis undertake great penances and austerities just to attain your impersonal effulgence. All these different persons, although concentrating their minds in different ways, achieve spiritual perfection according to their different perspectives, because you, O Lord, are equal to all your devotees.
Sridhara Swami has composed a nice verse in this regard. My dear Lord, to be engaged always in thinking of your lotus feet is very difficult. It is possible for great devotees who have already achieved love for you and are engaged in transcendental loving service. My dear Lord, I wish that my mind may also be fixed somehow or other on your lotus feet, at least for some time. The attainment of spiritual perfection by different spiritualists is explained in the Bhagavad Gita, wherein the Lord says that He grants the perfection the devotee desires in proportion to the devotee's surrender unto Him. The impersonalists, yogis, and enemies of the Lord enter into the Lord's transcendental effulgence, but the personalists who follow in the footsteps of the inhabitants of Vrindavan or strictly follow the path of devotional service are elevated to the personal abode of Krishna, Golok Vrindavan, or to the Vaikuntha planets. Both the impersonalists and the personalists enter the spiritual realm, the spiritual sky, but the impersonalists are given their place in the impersonal Brahman effulgence, whereas the personalists are given a position in the Vaikuntha planets or in the Vrindavan planet, according to their desire to serve the Lord in different mellows.
The personified Vedas stated that persons born after the creation of this material world cannot understand the existence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead by manipulating their material knowledge. Just as a person born in a particular family cannot understand the position of his great-grandfather who lived before the birth of the recent generation, we are unable to understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Narayan, or Krishna, who exists eternally in the spiritual world. In the 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, it is clearly said that the Supreme Person who lives eternally in the spiritual kingdom of God, Sanatan Dham, can be approached only by devotional service.
As for the material creations, Brahma is the first created person. Before Brahma, there was no living creature within this material world. It was void and dark until Brahma was born on the lotus flower that sprouted from the abdomen of Garbhadakshay Vishnu. Garbhadakshay Vishnu is an expansion of the Karanadakshay Vishnu. Karanadakshay Vishnu is an expansion of the Sankarshana, and Sankarshana is an expansion of Balarama, who is an immediate expansion of Lord Krishna. After the creation of Brahma, the two kinds of demigods were born, demigods like the four brothers Sanaka, Sanatan, Sanananda, and Sanat Kumar, who are representative of renunciations of the world, and demigods like Marichi and their descendants, who are meant to enjoy this material world. From these two kinds of demigods were gradually manifested all other living entities, including the human beings. Thus, all living creatures within this material world, including Brahma, all the demigods, and all the Rakshasas, are to be considered modern. This means that they were all born recently. Therefore, just as a person born recently in a family cannot understand the situation of his distant forefather, no one within this material world can understand the position of the Supreme Lord in the spiritual world, because the material world has only recently been created. Although they have a long duration of existence, all the manifestations of the material world, namely the time, element, and the living entities, the Vedas, and the gross and subtle material elements, are created at some point. Thus, any process manufactured within this created situation as a means for understanding the original source of creation is to be considered modern.
Therefore, by the process of self realization or God realization, through fruitive activities, philosophical speculation, or mystic yoga, one cannot actually approach the supreme source of everything. When the creation is completely terminated, when there is no existence of the Vedas, no existence of material time, and no existence of the gross and subtle material elements, and when all the living entities are in the non manifested stage, resting within Narayana, then all these manufactured processes become null and void and cannot act. Devotional service, however, is eternally going on in the eternal spiritual world. Therefore, the only factual process of self realization or God realization is devotional service. And one who takes to this process takes to the real process of God realization.
In this regard, Srila Sridhar Swami has composed a verse which conveys the idea that the supreme source of everything, the supreme personality of Godhead, is so great and unlimited that it is not possible for the living entity to understand him by any material acquisition. One should therefore pray to the Lord to be engaged in his devotional service eternally, so that by the grace of the Lord one can understand the supreme source of creation. The supreme source of creation, the supreme Lord, reveals himself only to the devotees. In the fourth chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says to the Arjuna, "My dear Arjuna, because you are my devotee and because you are my intimate friend, I shall reveal to you the process of understanding me." In other words, the supreme source of creation, the supreme personality of Godhead, cannot be understood by our own endeavor. We have to please him with devotional service, and then he will reveal himself to us. Then we can understand him to some extent.
There are different kinds of philosophers who have tried to understand the Supreme Source by their mental speculation. There are generally 6 kinds of mental speculators whose speculations are called sadarshana. All these philosophers are impersonalists and are known as Mayavadis. Every one of them has tried to establish his own opinion, although they all have later compromised and stated that all opinions lead to the same goal and that every opinion is therefore valid. According to the prayers of the personified Vedas, however, none of them is valid because their process of knowledge is created within the temporary material world. They have all missed the real point. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, or the Absolute Truth, can be understood only by devotional service.
One class of philosophers, known as Mimamsakas, represented by sages such as Jaimini, have concluded that everyone should engage in pious activities or prescribed duties, and that such activities will lead one to the highest perfection. But this is contradicted. This is contradicted in the 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, where Lord Krishna says that by pious activities one may be elevated to the heavenly planets, but that as soon as one's accumulation of pious activities is used up, one has to leave the enjoyment of a higher standard of material prosperity in the heavenly planets and immediately come down again to these low planets, where the duration of life is very short and where the standard of material happiness is of a low grade. The exact words used in the Bhagavad Gita are Kshine Punne Martya Lokam Vishanti. Therefore, the conclusion of the Mimamsaka philosophers that pious activities will lead one to the absolute truth is not valid. Although a pure devotee is by nature inclined to perform pious activities, no one can attain the favor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead by pious activities alone. Pious activities may purify one of the contamination caused by ignorance and passion, but this purification is automatically attained by a devotee constantly engaged in hearing the transcendental message of Godhead in the form of the Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, or similar scriptures. From the Bhagavad Gita, we understand that even a person who is not up to the standard of pious activities but who is absolutely engaged in devotional service is to be considered well situated on the path of spiritual perfection. It is also said in the Bhagavad Gita that a person who is engaged in devotional service with love and faith is guided from within by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Lord Himself, as Paramatma, or the spiritual master, sitting within one's heart, gives the devotee exact direction by which he can gradually go back to Godhead. The conclusion of the Mimamsaka philosophers is not actually the truth which can lead one to real understanding.
Similarly, there are Sankhya philosophers, metaphysicians, or materialistic scientists who study this cosmic manifestation by their invented scientific method and do not recognize the supreme authority of God as the creator of the cosmic manifestation. They wrongly conclude that the reactions of the material elements are the original cause of creation. The Bhagavad Gita, however, does not accept this theory. It is clearly said therein that behind the cosmic activities is the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This fact is corroborated by the Vedic injunction Sadva Saumyedam Agra Asit, which means that the origin of the creation existed before the cosmic manifestation. Therefore, the material elements cannot be the cause of the material creation. Although the material elements are accepted as immediate causes, the ultimate cause is the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself. The Bhagavad Gita says, therefore, that material nature works under the direction of Krishna.
The conclusion of the aesthetic Sankhya philosophy. The conclusion of the atheistic Sankhya philosophy is that because the effects, the phenomena of this world, material world, are temporary or illusory, the cause is therefore also illusory. The Sankhya philosophers are in favor of voidism, but the actual fact is that the original cause is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this cosmic manifestation is the temporary manifestation of his material energy. When this temporary manifestation is annihilated, its cause, the eternal existence of the spiritual world, continues as it is. And therefore, the spiritual world is called Sanatan Dhama, the eternal abode. The conclusion of the Sankhya philosophers is therefore invalid.
So that concludes our 1 hour of reading Krishna book to Srila Prabhupada this week. Srila Prabhupada, we would like to thank you every week for allowing us to come and read to you. And as always, let us offer our respectful obeisances to Srila Prabhupada and to each other. Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharane Nirvisesha Sunyavadi Paskacha Shatarne, and to each other. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So as mentioned before, this is the longest chapter that Srila Prabhupada wrote in his Krishna book, Prayers by the Personified Vedas. So mark your spot, and we'll continue next week. Hare Krishna. All glories to Srila Prabhupada, all glories to Krishna book. Shri Gauda Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai.